It took me a long time to realize that silence could be louder than screaming, that not saying anything, not asking, not begging, not explaining, could be the most powerful thing I've ever done. I used to think strength meant fighting back, proving my point, making him understand. I thought if I cried hard enough, wrote the right message, broke down at just the right moment, then maybe he'd finally see how much he hurt me. But he never did. Or maybe he did, and just didn't care. The truth is, I think he expected the breakdown. He expected the texts, the tears, the desperate attempts to pull him back, to hold on. That's how it always worked. I'd react, he'd retreat, and then somehow I'd be the one apologizing for feeling too much. I didn't even notice how predictable I'd become, how easy it was for him to push a button and watch me fall apart. But one day something shifted. It wasn't even a dramatic moment, no big fight, no last straw. I just stopped. I looked at my reflection and saw someone I didn't recognize. Tired eyes, a voice that no longer sounded like mine, a woman who kept twisting herself into knots, trying to be understood by someone who had no intention of listening. And in that quiet moment, something inside me whispered, "Don't play the game this time." So I didn't. I didn't answer. I didn't reach out. I didn't perform my pain for him like I always had. I chose silence, not because I didn't feel anything, but because I finally realized that what I felt didn't need to be proved or witnessed to be real. At first, it was terrifying. I'm not going to pretend it wasn't. There were nights I lay in bed gripping my phone like it held the key to my dignity. I'd write out messages and delete them. I'd stare at his online status, wondering if he noticed my absence. My chest would ache with the weight of everything unspoken. But I stayed quiet, not out of pride, out of self-respect, because I knew for the first time that breaking my own heart to be heard by someone who wasn't listening was no longer an option. And something strange started to happen. The more I held back, the more I could hear myself. My thoughts got clearer. My emotions weren't thrashing around as much. It was like my soul had finally found a space to breathe. That space, that silence, wasn't empty. It was full of all the things I had been too distracted to notice. My own voice, my needs, my pain, and also my strength. I remembered something Jung once said, that people are terrified of the void because it forces them to meet the parts of themselves they've been avoiding. That silence is where the shadow lives, and maybe without knowing it, that's what I created for him. A mirror he couldn't look away from, no drama to hide behind, no chaos to blame, just my absence and his own actions echoing back at him, and maybe he didn't even notice at first. Maybe he thought I was just playing hard to get. But the thing is, I wasn't playing anymore. I wasn't performing anything. I was reclaiming myself. Piece by piece, breath by breath, and it hurt like hell, but it was honest, and that made all the difference. So if you're sitting there wondering whether silence is weakness, let me tell you, it's not. Silence, when it comes from clarity, is strength in its purest form. It's the refusal to let someone else write your story. It's standing still while everything in you wants to run. It's choosing peace over validation, self-worth over temporary comfort. He expected me to crumble. He expected to win by default, simply because I'd always let him. But this time, I chose to lose him instead. And in doing that, I started to find something I didn't even know I'd lost. Myself. What I didn't expect was how much space he had taken up in my mind. It was like he'd built a home inside me, decorated with old conversations, little hopes, moments I replayed over and over again. And now, in his absence, I had to walk through those rooms alone, clearing them out. It was quiet, but it wasn't peaceful at first. It was haunting. Every silence echoed back at me with memories I didn't know were still lingering. But something else started happening too. The longer I stayed away, the more I realized how much of my energy had been consumed by trying to hold us together. It wasn't just the relationship that had been draining me. It was the emotional labor of trying to convince someone to care, to stay, to see me. I'd been doing all the work, patching holes in a ship he kept setting on fire, and the silence, it became my boundary. It wasn't a wall meant to punish him. It was a door I closed gently behind me, not slammed, just shut. No explanation, no final message, no drawn-out closure. Because here's the truth, some people don't deserve a front-row seat to your healing, especially the ones who broke you in the first place. It was strange, though. I think he expected me to snap, to come back after a few days, maybe a week, full of fury or sorrow, begging him to explain, to fix it, to hold me. That's what I'd always done before. That's what most people do when they're in pain. They try to reach the source, even if it's the very thing that caused the wound. But I didn't reach out, and I could tell it started to bother him. First, it was the random likes on old photos, then a hey message, like nothing had happened. Then silence again when I didn't respond. It was subtle, but I saw it for what it was. A fishing line. He wasn't sorry. He was curious. Curious if he still had access, still had control. That was all it ever was. Control. You learn a lot when you stop reacting. When you remove the fuel from someone's fire, you get to see what they're really made of. And he wasn't made of much, just ego and patterns and a deep fear of not being important anymore. That's the thing about men like him. They thrive on your attention, even your pain, maybe especially your pain, because as long as you're hurting over them, they still matter. But I'd stopped bleeding for him, quietly, softly, like a wound that finally clotted on its own. No bandages, no apology, just the body doing what it's supposed to do, protect itself. I started waking up differently. I don't know when it happened, but at some point the first thought in my mind wasn't him anymore. It was me, what I wanted to do that day, how I wanted to feel. I'd sip coffee and notice how warm the mug felt in my hands, and for once that moment wasn't invaded by sadness. It was just mine. It's not that I stopped loving him overnight. Love doesn't work that way. But I stopped needing him. And that changed everything. He thought silence meant weakness, that I was sulking, waiting, hoping. But silence was me building a life without him in it. And with every day that passed, that life got stronger, louder, fuller, and the space he once took up, I filled it with laughter that wasn't performative, books that made me think, long walks with no destination, new dreams, real rest. It's not that I was pretending I was okay. I was becoming okay, slowly, genuinely, day by day. It was never about making him regret. That's the mistake so many people make, trying to heal just to show someone else what they lost. No. This was about reclaiming my energy, not redirecting it toward revenge. He might never realize the depth of what he had. Or maybe he will, in a quiet moment, when the silence finally gets to him too. Maybe he'll wonder why I never came back. Maybe he'll tell himself a story about how I changed, or stopped caring. But I'll know the truth. I didn't stop caring. I just started caring more about myself. And that made all the difference. There's something incredibly liberating about reaching the point where you no longer seek closure. I used to think I needed it, a conversation, an explanation, an apology that would somehow tie everything into a neat little bow. But closure isn't something another person gives you. It's something you give yourself in the quiet aftermath, when you decide your peace matters more than their version of the story. I think we're trained to believe that walking away without a fight means surrender, that if you don't scream or demand answers, you're weak. But that's not true. Walking away with dignity, with no need to prove anything, That takes more strength than I ever thought I had. He probably didn't understand that at first. He might have interpreted my silence as pride or emotional immaturity, but it wasn't that. It was me, choosing to protect the last intact parts of myself. You can only run through a burning house so many times before you realize the fire was never meant to be tamed. It was meant to be left behind, and I left it. Every time I wanted to write to him, I wrote to myself instead. Pages and pages in my journal, raw, unfiltered, not polished thoughts for someone else's understanding, but messy truths I had to pull out of my own chest. Why wasn't I enough? Turned into, why did I believe I had to prove my worth to someone who never valued it? Slowly, my questions stopped circling around him and started facing me, because the real pain wasn't losing him. It was realizing how far I'd wandered from myself just to keep him close. I started reclaiming that lost ground, one decision at a time. I said no more often. I rested when I was tired, not when everything was done. I deleted pictures that made me ache and saved the ones that reminded me who I used to be before I gave so much of myself away. I went out without needing to post about it, smiled at strangers, sat alone in cafes just to hear the hum of life that had nothing to do with him. And you know what I learned? Peace doesn't always feel like joy at first. Sometimes it's heavy, lonely, still. But underneath that stillness is the soil where everything new begins to grow. There were moments I missed him, or maybe not him, but the version of him I once believed in. That part hurt. Grieving the illusion, the hope, the fantasy. But that grief was clean. It didn't chain me to the past like guilt or self-blame. It just washed through me like rain through cracked soil. And with every storm, I felt something small begin to root. He, on the other hand, started showing signs of noticing my absence in ways only he could. Half-hearted messages, reactions to old memories, indirect little nudges. Nothing vulnerable, nothing brave. Just enough to test if the door was still open. But it wasn't. Not because I hated him, but because I loved myself too much to reopen what had already closed. I used to think love was about holding on. Now I know. Real love, the kind that heals, sometimes looks like letting go. Not because the other person changed, not because things got better, but because you finally saw things clearly and made peace with the truth. He wasn't your home. You were. And in that realization, everything shifted. There's a particular kind of freedom in no longer needing someone's acknowledgement to feel whole. I wasn't waiting for him to come back. I wasn't hoping he'd see the light. I had stopped orbiting his world. I had become my own sun again, not perfect, not always bright, but mine. And that felt like power, not the loud, showy kind, the quiet kind, the kind that lives in your spine, your breath, your decisions, the kind that doesn't need to be proven, only lived. That's when I knew I hadn't just walked away from him, I'd walked back to myself. It's strange how your body remembers things even when your mind is trying to move on. Certain songs, places, smells, they hit you like a ghost brushing past your shoulder. One moment you're fine, the next you're somewhere else entirely, back in the thick of it, back where the pain still lingers. But here's the thing. Each time it happened, the sting was a little less sharp. The memories started to lose their grip. They became just that. Memories, not anchors, not weapons, just remnants of a life I no longer lived in. I think the real turning point came when I stopped needing him to be the villain. For a long time, I held on to my anger like a shield. I needed to believe he was cruel, selfish, broken, something that would justify how deeply I'd been hurt. But the truth is more complicated. He wasn't always terrible. He had good moments. He had charm, laughter, a kind of magnetism that pulled me in. That's what made it so hard to leave. not just the pain, but the good that kept me hooked in between the pain. But when I really looked at it, with clear eyes and no illusions, I saw the pattern. He gave just enough to keep me hoping, then disappeared when I needed him most. And every time I tried harder, I gave more, I loved louder, I bent until I broke, and I told myself that maybe if I could just get it right, he'd finally stay. But people don't stay because you're perfect. They stay because they choose to. And he never really chose me, not fully. Not in the way that mattered. That realization shattered something in me. But it also set something free. I stopped romanticizing the almosts, the maybe next times. I stopped replaying the apologies he never gave and the words I never got to say. I stopped building castles out of scraps, stopped twisting myself into shapes I thought he'd love more. Instead, I stood in the rubble and decided I would build something real, not for him, but for me. I started with small things, drinking more water, stretching in the morning, calling friends back, making playlists that felt like sunshine, writing things I didn't plan to share with anyone, reconnecting with the parts of myself that had gone quiet. They were still there, just waiting for me to come back. And with time, something even more unexpected happened. I stopped needing closure altogether. I stopped waiting for the grand apology, the teary regret, the scene where he shows up and finally sees me for who I am. Because the truth is, I've always been that person, and if he couldn't see it then, he sure as hell doesn't get to benefit from it now. There's this quiet joy that comes when you realize you no longer crave being understood by the one who misunderstood you the most. You stop performing, you stop proving, you just live. And that living, it's not always dramatic or picture perfect. Sometimes it's just making a cup of tea and realizing it tastes better when you're not crying into it. Sometimes it's going a whole day without thinking about him. Sometimes it's catching your reflection and smiling, not because you look amazing, but because you feel peace, and that shows. He'll probably never know the depth of what he lost. Maybe he'll convince himself I overreacted, that I was too sensitive, too much, too emotional. Let him. That story is no longer mine to correct. I'm done shrinking myself to fit inside his comfort zone. What matters is what I know now. I know what it feels like to choose myself when every part of me wanted to run back. I know how strong I am, not because I fought for him, but because I stopped. I didn't let the pain define me. I didn't let the silence break me. I let it teach me. And what it taught me is this: when someone shows you they can live without you, believe them. But more importantly, show yourself that you can live even better without them. That's not bitterness, that's rebirth. There's this moment, and it doesn't come with fireworks or music swelling in the background, where you realize you're no longer waiting, not for his call, not for an apology, not for him to finally get it. You're just here, present, living. And it feels strange at first, because for so long, everything revolved around the hope that maybe, just maybe, he'd come around. But he doesn't, and that becomes the miracle you didn't know you needed. It hits you in the little things. The way you sleep better now, uninterrupted by midnight tears or overthinking. The way your days feel spacious, like there's room again. Room for your thoughts, your dreams, your peace. You don't realize how much of your mental real estate someone took up until they're gone. And suddenly there's space to breathe again. And in that breath, you begin to notice your own rhythm. Not the rhythm of waiting or chasing or bracing yourself for the next letdown, but the rhythm of self. The soft, steady beat of someone coming home to themselves. That's what this healing has felt like. A return. Not to the person I was before him, but to someone wiser, softer in the right places, stronger in the ones that used to collapse too easily. And I wish I could say he faded quietly into the background, but people like him rarely do. They linger. They resurface. Not because they care deeply, but because they crave the reassurance that they're still relevant in your life. He started showing up again. Subtle, half-hearted attempts. A comment here, a message there, an old photo liked at 2 a.m. It was never about reconnection. It was about testing the waters, seeing if the door was still cracked open. But it wasn't. Not anymore. And that, I think, is what finally shook him. Because when you've trained someone to believe that they are your sun, that your world orbits them, and then you stop spinning, it creates a kind of gravity they don't know how to live without. I used to orbit him. Everything I did, my pain, my healing, even my silence, once revolved around him, but not anymore. My silence now has nothing to do with him. It's not waiting, it's not a tactic, it's simply peace. That's the part he couldn't understand, that I wasn't playing. I wasn't hoping he'd chase me. I wasn't sculpting my glow for his regret. I was just done, not out of anger, but out of clarity. I finally saw him clearly. The patterns, the excuses, the way he moved through people like they were disposable. And I decided that wouldn't be my story anymore. And the more I stepped into that clarity, the more I saw how much I had dimmed myself to fit into his world. I remembered all the times I'd made myself smaller, quieter, less difficult, just to be palatable. I remembered how I apologized for things that weren't mine to carry, how I explained myself to death trying to be understood, instead of just walking away from someone who didn't want to understand. That's the thing no one tells you. Healing isn't just about getting over someone. It's about getting under all the lies you told yourself while you loved them. It's unlearning the belief that their treatment of you was a reflection of your worth. It's forgiving yourself for all the times you stayed when you knew you should have left. And it's promising yourself, with every fiber of who you are, that you won't do that again. He might regret losing me one day. He might not. That's not my business anymore. What I know is this. I no longer feel like I'm missing something. I don't look for his name when my phone lights up. I don't reread old messages. I don't wonder what I did wrong, because I didn't do anything wrong. I just stopped handing my heart to someone who didn't know how to hold it. And that's not loss. That's liberation. There's a kind of grief that comes not from losing someone, but from realizing how long you kept yourself small to keep them close. That grief is quiet, but it runs deep. It's in the way you remember shrinking yourself, biting your tongue, softening your needs, pretending not to notice the red flags because hope made you blind. And when that realization hits, it cuts sharper than any breakup ever could. I used to think love meant compromise. I used to think it was noble, even romantic, to be the one who stayed, who understood, who held it all together. But now I see that what I called love was often just self-abandonment. I was constantly bending, adjusting, making space for his inconsistency, and I called that devotion. But the truth is, it was desperation dressed up as loyalty, and I know that sounds harsh. I don't mean to paint myself as a victim or him as a monster, but looking back, I see how often I made excuses for behavior that should have been a hard no. I confused potential with reality. I fell in love with who he could be, not who he was. And that's not love, that's projection, that's shadow work, that's everything Jung tried to teach us. Because when you project, you're not in a relationship with the person in front of you. You're in a relationship with your unmet needs, your unresolved wounds. Your childhood echoes that whisper, if I'm good enough, maybe this time I'll be chosen. And that's what I was doing, chasing validation from someone who couldn't even validate himself. But here's the wild part. Once you stop chasing, once you stand still and really look at the truth, the spell breaks. And it hurts. God, it hurts. Because you have to admit that the love you thought you had was mostly your own. Given freely, poured out like water into hands that were never open to receive it. He didn't take me for granted because he was evil. He took me for granted because I taught him that he could. I showed him over and over that no matter what he did, I'd still be there, that my forgiveness was endless, my boundaries negotiable, my love unconditional. And while love might be unconditional, access should never be. So I took it back, all of it, my time, my energy, my heart, not as a punishment, but as a quiet revolution. I stopped explaining myself, stopped hoping he'd wake up one day and realize what he lost. I realized it didn't matter anymore, because even if he did, it wouldn't change who he was. And it wouldn't make me forget the nights I cried myself to sleep while he acted like my pain was an inconvenience. And honestly, the scariest part wasn't losing him. It was facing the version of myself I had become with him, the version who settled, who tolerated, who believed she wasn't quite enough. That version of me, she deserved better, and now she's finally getting it. Every step I take forward feels like a small act of rebellion against the story I once told myself, the story that said I had to earn love, that I had to fight for it, prove myself worthy of it. But love doesn't work like that. The real kind doesn't make you chase it. It meets you where you are. It doesn't require you to disappear to be chosen. I know he's probably still confused, still checking in silently, wondering how I'm doing. Maybe telling himself I moved on too quickly or that I never really cared. But the truth is, I moved on the moment I realized I didn't need his version of love anymore. I moved on when I chose my peace over his presence. He might never understand what he lost, but I finally understand what I gained. Me. You know what they don't tell you about healing? That it's not always loud. It's not some grand transformation with fireworks and dramatic endings. Most of the time it's quiet, subtle. A moment when you laugh and realize you didn't think about him all day. A Sunday morning where you're sipping coffee in the sunlight and your chest isn't heavy anymore. It sneaks up on you like that. Not with a bang, but with a breath. And somewhere in that stillness you realize you're free, not just from him. From the version of yourself that kept settling for crumbs and calling it a feast. From the cycle of proving, pleasing, performing. You're no longer living for the what if or the maybe one day. You're not waiting on his recognition, his validation, his regret, because you've given yourself something better. Recognition that your heart is worthy, validation that your needs were never too much, and regret. That's his to carry now, not yours. He may come back. Most do. Not out of love, but out of ego. Out of the discomfort that comes when the person they thought would always be there isn't. Out of the ache that settles in when they see you thriving, smiling, living without them. They mistake your peace for punishment. They can't fathom that you're not trying to hurt them. You're simply no longer available for the version of love they offered. And when that realization hits them, it's crushing, because it forces them to confront the truth. They weren't as irreplaceable as they thought, that you didn't fall apart like they assumed you would, that their absence wasn't your ending. It was your beginning. But you're not waiting for that moment. You're not checking your phone or rehearsing what you'd say if he called, because the most powerful thing you ever did was stop making him the center of your world. You walked away, not with bitterness, not with vengeance, but with grace. Quiet, grounded grace. The kind that says, I love myself too much to stay where I'm not seen. And that grace, it changed everything. It gave you your life back, your laughter, your softness, your power. You stopped shrinking to fit inside someone else's comfort zone. You stopped editing yourself to be easier to love. And in doing that, you became whole. I know you still think about him sometimes. That's okay. Healing isn't erasure. It's integration. It's being able to remember without reliving. to see the wound without picking at the scar. You'll have days when it still aches, memories that pull at you unexpectedly. But even then, you won't unravel, because now you know how to hold yourself. Now you know your worth isn't up for debate, and if he ever does come back, don't be surprised if he tries to speak in poetry, telling you he's changed, that he sees it now, that he misses who you were. But you'll know the difference between a man who's transformed and a man who just hates the silence you left behind, between someone who wants to grow with you and someone who just wants to feel significant again. You don't owe anyone a second chance at what they failed to cherish the first time, because you didn't walk away to teach him a lesson. You walked away because you finally learned yours. And that's the kind of story that doesn't need a sequel. You're not the woman he lost. You're the woman he never really saw until it was too late. And now? Now you've become someone he can't reach, not because you disappeared, but because you rose.